The Sunday dinner table went quiet, except for the clink of glasses. Dad stood up with his hands trembling slightly, and Mom placed her hand on his arm in that possessive way that had always made me uncomfortable. I was 51 years old, and I recognized the expression immediately. The one they used when they were about to announce something they'd already decided, without consulting anyone who might disagree. Owen sat across from me in his new polo shirt, the smirk already spreading across his face like he knew exactly what was coming, like he'd been prepared for this moment for weeks. Miles, my husband of 23 years, reached over and squeezed my hand. A warning, or maybe an apology, I couldn't tell yet, but the pressure felt like something official, like a signal of allegiance that he was communicating in advance. "We wanted to do this together," Mom said, her voice soft and careful in the way that meant this had been rehearsed. "All of us, as a family. We've been doing estate planning, and we have an announcement." Dad raised his glass higher, the crystal catching the light from the chandelier. "We've decided to give the house to Owen." The words landed like stones into still water, creating ripples that moved outward in all directions. The same house. The house with the roof I'd paid $3,400 to replace 4 years ago. The house whose property taxes I'd covered twice when Dad's hours got cut at the manufacturing plant. The house I'd been sending monthly help for since I was 32 years old. Money I'd carefully labeled house fund in my bank app. Money that I'd believed was building toward something. Toward security, toward acknowledgement that I'd done something that mattered. Owen's smirk turned into a full grin. He actually stood up and raised his own glass. Didn't even look at me, his face flushed with the kind of pleasure that comes from winning something you'd been betting on. "Guess you were just paying rent," he said loudly, and everyone except Miles laughed. The kind of laugh that was sharp and cutting and designed to sting. My mouth went dry. I felt Miles's hand tighten on mine, trying to communicate something urgent through pressure alone. "Stay calm. Don't react. Let it go. Don't make a scene." But I was already doing the math in my head, the way I always did when something terrible happened, calculating quickly. 14 years of contributions, 20 to 30,000 in direct payments, maybe more when you counted the smaller bills, the home repairs I'd arranged, the contractors I'd coordinated with, the insurance claims I'd filed. Then Mom added her sweetness like poison to an already bitter cup, her voice taking on that particular tone that made the words sound kind when they were actually devastating. "Oh, and Miles, honey," she said, looking directly at my husband with that practiced, concerned expression that she saved for serious moments. "We thought you should know Diana already did." The words took a second to land properly, but when they did, I understood everything. Miles already knew, not just knew about the gift. Knew about whatever arrangement had been made with Owen. Knew that Owen was walking away with the house while I was standing here, realizing that the man I'd married had been on the other side of this decision the entire time. I looked at my husband. His face was carefully blank, carefully trained into the expression of someone who didn't want to be caught doing something wrong. "I'm Rain. I'm 51 years old now, and I've spent most of my life being the reliable one, the one people called when there was a crisis. The one who said yes when there should have been a no. The one who sent money without keeping score, even though every deposit was a small piece of my own future disappearing into someone else's foundation and plans I had no control over. The house had belonged to my parents for 30 years. It was a solid place, brick and wood, and a wraparound porch, the kind of house that looked respectable from the street but needed constant maintenance that my parents could never quite afford. I'd bought my own home 7 years ago, a small cottage with a manageable mortgage and a roof that didn't leak, but I never stopped paying attention to theirs. Never stopped feeling responsible for it. Like having a house somehow meant it should be maintained, and a house is just walls and problems and endless expense waiting to happen. Over the last 14 years, the contributions had added up like water wearing stone. There was the roof. $3,400, invoiced to my name, because the contractor needed a different number for their records. Needed someone with established credit to finance the work. Property taxes went unpaid 1 year, and I covered them quietly, using a credit card to avoid direct confrontation about why my parents hadn't budgeted for something they'd known was coming. Car insurance premiums I'd paid. Homeowner's insurance I'd renewed. Water damage from a pipe burst that required emergency repairs and cost nearly $2,000. New gutters after a storm. Foundation cracks that needed sealing by a professional. I'd paid for all of it, sometimes in installments spread across several months, sometimes in full when the situation required immediate action. When I thought about it all together, organized by category in a spreadsheet I'd created, the number was somewhere north of $50,000. I knew this because I'd looked at my bank records the night after that Sunday dinner, and I'd tracked every single transfer, every payment, every contribution, verifying the amounts against old invoices and receipts I'd kept organized in a plastic container. Miles wouldn't meet my eyes when I started pulling up the documents at the kitchen table, when he saw that I was creating a timeline of all the money, all the years, all the promises that had apparently meant nothing. He sat there with his coffee getting cold, watching me organize receipts and statements into piles by year, and he wouldn't look at me. That was when I really understood that whatever had happened, it had been decided without me and decided with my husband on the other side of the decision. "How long?" I asked him quietly, my voice steady even though my hands were shaking. "How long did you know?" He took a long time answering, the kind of pause that meant he was calculating his response, choosing his words carefully. "Your mom called me 2 months ago. She said they wanted to give the house to Owen, and she wanted to know how you'd take it. She wanted to be prepared." 2 months. 2 months of him knowing. 2 months of him not telling me. 2 months of him sitting with my mother and probably listening while she explained why this made sense, why Owen deserved the house more, why I was being generous anyway, and should just accept the loss gracefully. "And you said what?" My voice sounded strange to my own ears, thin and tight and controlled. "You told her I'd be fine with it?" He took another pause. "I said you'd be upset, but that it was their house to give. I said it was their property and their decision to make." The words hung between us like something that had died and wouldn't fall down, wouldn't dissolve, wouldn't go away, no matter how much time passed. Their house, not my roof, not my taxes, not my sacrifice translated into bricks and foundation and the security of knowing one more person had shelter and safety. Just their house given away by them. And I was supposed to smile and accept that the money had never meant anything, except that I was generous and a little bit foolish. I turned back to my bank app, where the repeating transfer memo told a different story entirely. House fund. Over and over again. My own notes to myself about where the money was going and why. My own acknowledgement that this meant something, that I was building something, that I had a plan and a reason for every single payment. The first lie came wrapped in Dad's shrug the next morning. When I called and asked if we could talk about what had happened, if we could have a real conversation about the house and the money and the promises that apparently had never been serious at all. He picked up on the fourth ring, and I could hear the television in the background, some morning show that I'd heard 1,000 times in that house, a program they watched every single day without fail. "We never asked you to pay for anything," he said, which wasn't true, which was the opposite of true, because they'd called multiple times asking for help, asking if I could cover the roof, asking if I could handle the taxes, asking if I could handle this bill or that bill, just asking and asking until I'd said yes, so many times I stopped counting the times I'd said no. Mom came on the phone after him, her voice carrying that particular tone of wounded confusion that made me feel like I was the one being unreasonable, like I was the one asking for something outrageous. "You offered to help us, Rain. Nobody twisted your arm. You're acting like this is some kind of investment, like the house was yours. You can't buy love or family." "I sent you $50,000, I said, my voice steady because I'd practiced staying calm through hard conversations, because I'd learned that raising my voice only gave people like my parents more ammunition to use against me. Over 14 years, for repairs and taxes and insurance. I have every receipt. I have bank statements. I have everything documented." "And we're grateful," Mom said. which wasn't the same as admitting I'd paid for anything concrete. Grateful was what you said to someone who'd given you a gift, not what you said to someone who'd made an arrangement with you and then broken it deliberately. Owen texted me that same afternoon. I had to scroll up through months of sparse messages to find the beginning of the conversation. Because he and I didn't talk much, had never been particularly close. He was 8 years younger than me, the baby of the family. The one who'd always seemed to find his way without struggling the way I struggled, without working the way I worked. Guess you were just paying rent, had apparently been just the opening act of whatever he was planning to do. Moving in next week, he'd written, the message casual and cruel in a way that only family can manage. Changing the locks. Don't want anything stolen while I'm settling in. Making it clear who owns what. The words were small and typed out like he was mentioning the weather, mentioning something insignificant, but they hit like cold water. Changing the locks meant he was serious. Changing the locks meant he understood that I might try to claim something, that I needed to be kept out, that he needed to be prepared to defend his ownership against me. I showed the text to Miles, who read it and said nothing, which was worse than if he'd tried to defend Owen or explain it away. Silence from my husband felt like agreement, felt like he was on Owen's side, felt like I was the problem in this situation. Miles tried to make it small, make it manageable, make it something that we could move past if I would just stop being upset about it, if I would just let it go like a normal person would. He said it while we were getting ready for bed that night, his voice gentle and tired in a way that made me understand he'd been preparing this conversation for weeks, had probably rehearsed it with his mother. Let it go, he said, pulling back the bedspread like this was just another night, just another evening in a long series of ordinary evenings. It's family. You're going to tear everyone apart. And for what? A house you don't own anyway. A house your parents own and chose to give to your brother. I turned to look at him, my shirt half buttoned, trying to understand how my husband had moved to the other side of this without me knowing he was walking across the line, without telling me, without giving me a chance to understand his reasoning. I paid for the roof, Miles. I paid for the taxes. I paid for the foundation repairs and the insurance and the gutters and... I know what you paid for, he interrupted, and his voice had that edge now, that frustrated sound that meant he'd made a decision about who was wrong in this situation, and I was it, that he'd already chosen his side. But you offered. You offered, and now you're acting like they owe you something. You're acting like you have a claim on a house that doesn't belong to you. Because they do owe me, I said, and I heard my voice getting louder, and I pulled it back down, forced myself to stay calm. They owe me the truth. They owe me the courtesy of telling me before they gave away something I'd been investing in for 14 years. They owe me. Janice warned me you'd react like this, he said suddenly, and the words were so unexpected that I actually stopped mid-sentence, my mouth open, my argument half-formed. Janice, my mother-in-law, Owen's mother, not my mother. The woman I saw at family gatherings and tried to be polite to, even though she'd never been particularly kind to me, even though she had a way of making comments that landed like paper cuts, small, stinging, designed to make you question yourself, to make you wonder if you were being unreasonable. Janice was involved in this? I asked slowly, the words coming out quiet, trying to understand the extent of the conspiracy, the number of people who'd known and not told me. Miles wouldn't meet my eyes. She and your mom talk. She mentioned that you might take it hard, that you're sensitive about family stuff. She said I should be prepared for drama, for you to get upset, for this to become a bigger thing than it needs to be. The room suddenly felt very small, the walls pressing in, the air getting thin. It wasn't just my parents and Owen. It wasn't just a bad decision made by people I'd been supporting. Janice was in it too, which meant Miles had been talked to by his mother about how I would react, which meant they'd all been discussing me and my character and my likely overreaction while I was paying bills that nobody had asked me to document, nobody had asked me to track, nobody had acknowledged as anything except help that I'd voluntarily given. The paper trail started talking the next morning when I couldn't sleep, and got up at 5 in the morning and started pulling files I'd kept in a plastic container under the bedroom closet. I'd always been someone who saved receipts, who tracked expenses, who made notes in margins about where money had gone and why. It's a habit that had probably saved me from complete financial ruin at various points in my life. And it was about to save me again. I laid out the receipts on the kitchen table in chronological order, spreading them across the surface like evidence at a crime scene. The roof invoice from 2020, $4,000, paid in full from my checking account with the check number and date visible. Property tax notices from 2016 and 2018, both marked paid, both with my name on the correspondence. Insurance documents, water damage claims that I'd filed myself, I'd paid the deductible on, I'd coordinated with contractors about. Gutter work invoices, foundation repair estimates I'd approved, a new septic tank installation that had run $7,000 and that I'd somehow managed to cover by delaying my own car payment. This wasn't help. This was carrying. This was me being the foundation that everything else was built on. And nobody acknowledging the weight of that, not even to themselves, not even when they looked at the bills that came and understood where the money had come from. I was halfway through making copies of everything, organized by year, organized by category, organized like I was preparing evidence for a case, when I found the transfer I didn't recognize. It was from 6 years ago, right around when the house had gotten particularly expensive, right around when Dad's hours had gotten cut again at work, and Mom had started making those exhausted phone calls, asking if I could help with something. Just something small, just this one thing. And it wouldn't be for long. The transfer was $20,000, and the memo line said, Title Company. I sat very still with that piece of paper in my hand, trying to understand what a $20,000 payment to a title company meant. Trying to piece together a timeline, trying to remember if my parents had mentioned refinancing or anything like that. They hadn't. They'd never mentioned anything except that they needed help, that there was an emergency, that I was good with money, and maybe I could figure something out. My hands were shaking when I called my friend Brooke. She was the only one I knew who'd studied real estate law before deciding it wasn't for her and going into teaching instead. She picked up on the second ring, heard something in my voice, and said she'd drive over right away, that she was worried about me. I found something, I said when she arrived, showing her the transfer. I don't know what it means. Brooke's face went pale as she read it. A title company transfer, she said quietly. That's, Raina, that could mean a lot of things. The county recorder's office smelled like paper and old wood, and the particular kind of mustiness that comes from old buildings holding old records. The clerk who helped me was patient and thorough, clicking through screens with the kind of resignation that came from answering the same questions 1,000 times a month. She was a woman probably in her 60s, with reading glasses on a chain and the kind of knowing expression that suggested she'd seen every family drama there was. When was the deed last transferred? I asked, trying to sound casual, trying not to sound like someone whose entire understanding of her financial life was about to be overturned. The clerk typed for a moment, squinted at the screen. Looks like last month. From your parents to Owen. It's recent. Last month. Last month was the month after the Sunday dinner. The month after Owen had texted about changing the locks. Last month was the month when Miles had been walking around the house looking guilty and deflecting any conversation about what had happened. Which meant they'd been planning the transfer for longer than that. Which meant they'd probably been planning it before the Sunday dinner, before the announcement. Before they'd even let it be known to me that they'd decided Owen deserved it more. There was an earlier transfer, the clerk continued, clicking backward through time, scrolling through years of documents. About 6 years ago, parents too. She paused, squinted, adjusted her glasses. That one's interesting. Looks like your parents transferred ownership to a trust. Clear title held in trust. Your father as trustee. What does that mean? I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew. It meant they'd been planning to protect the asset, It meant they'd been thinking about succession for a long time, thinking about who would get what, thinking about everything except telling me that my money, my $50,000 of money, was going into a house that I would never own, that they'd already been planning to give away. And the deed was notarized? I asked. Yeah, every transfer has been notarized. You can see the stamp here, see? The clerk pointed to a faded mark on the printout they gave me, the official seal of whoever had witnessed the signing. Your father's signature, notarized, all proper. Everything looks official. I took the printout with hands that felt strange to me, like they belonged to someone else, someone who was about to do something serious and irreversible. I thanked the clerk and walked out into the morning light, and I didn't go to work that day. Instead, I sat in my car in the parking lot and called Brooke back and asked her if she could recommend an attorney, a real attorney, someone who handled property disputes and wasn't afraid to pursue things even when family was involved. The notary stamp belonged to someone named Alicia Voss, and her business was registered at a UPS store 17 miles from my parents' house. I found this out when Brooke sent me the information after she'd done some preliminary research, after I'd paid her a consultation fee, and she'd started treating this like something real, something that mattered, something worth pursuing legally. The UPS store was in a strip mall between a dry cleaner and a nail salon, and the address on the notary record was definitely that UPS store. Definitely not anywhere near the hospital. I'd called the hospital to ask when my father had been admitted on the day that the deed had been transferred. The date on the paperwork. The date that Owen had mentioned casually. And the answer was simple and concrete. My father had been in the emergency room that day, had been there for 6 hours with a cardiac scare that turned out to be nothing, but had been there, had been under observation, had been nowhere near capable of signing documents legally or traveling 17 miles to a strip mall. But the notary stamp said he had signed. The notary journal would show exactly when and where. And that was what I needed. That was what Brooke told me to request. That was when I'd understand exactly how badly I'd been played. I was in my office at work, staring at the request I'd sent to the county notary board, when Brooke called me back. Her voice was different, more careful, more serious than I'd heard it since I'd first explained the whole situation. There was something important she needed to tell me. Rainey, she said. And then she said, I talked to someone, a woman I know who works in probate law. She said to tell you something important. Tell me what? I asked, though some part of me already knew this was going to be worse than I'd thought, that there were layers to this I hadn't discovered yet. Your mom asked me to witness something once, Brooke said slowly. It was about 5 years ago. She asked me to come over and witness some paperwork. I said no. I didn't want to be involved in anything like that. I remember thinking it was weird that she was asking, that she was pressuring me about it, making it seem urgent. The words were small, but they changed everything. My mother had been reaching out to multiple people, building a case for something, trying to establish witnesses to documents that might not have been legitimate. My mother, who claimed I was being dramatic, had been doing exactly the kind of careful, documented planning that I was learning required legal help to undo. Owen moved in on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning, I had a message from him that made my blood cold. The text was simple and cruel in the way that only family can be, designed to hurt while maintaining plausible deniability. $800 a month if you want to store your stuff in the garage, the text said, casual and cruel. Fair's fair. Can't let you use the space for free. New owner, new rules. I didn't have anything in the garage. I'd never stored anything in that garage. But the implication was clear. This was his house now, and if I dared to claim any ownership, any right to be there, any right to anything related to the property I'd spent 14 years paying for, it would cost me money. Later that afternoon, Owen posted on social media. My house, my rules, the caption said, and the photo was of my father's favorite chair, the one that had sat in the living room for 20 years, the one that Dad had sat in while watching football games, while reading the newspaper on Sunday mornings, the one that belonged to the house and therefore belonged to Owen now. Redesigning with style, the caption continued. and the photo showed the chair outside on the curb with what looked like trash, like garbage, like something that didn't matter, like something discarded. I made the mistake of showing the post to Miles, who barely glanced at it before saying, "He's just settling in. Don't read too much into it. It's just a chair." But I was reading something into it. I was reading that Owen understood what he'd done. I was reading that he understood I might try to claim the house, might try to assert some right to it, and he was making his position clear. I had no claim, no right, no stake in anything that was his now. He was drawing a line. That night I started making a timeline. Not just of the money, that was already documented, already organized, already ready, but of the messages, the texts, the little cruelties that showed Owen knew exactly what had happened and felt no remorse about it. I was beginning to understand that I wasn't crazy for being upset, wasn't dramatic for taking this seriously, wasn't being unreasonable to think that this might actually be something that required legal action to fix. The humiliation spread slower than I expected, which was somehow worse than if it had been fast. My mother called people and told them I was being difficult, was making trouble, was trying to take advantage of her aging parents. My father avoided my calls altogether, let them go to voicemail, refused to engage. Owen told people at work that I was trying to take advantage of my aging parents, that I was being greedy, that I'd always been the selfish one in the family, and this just proved it. Miles's mother, Janice, called our house one evening while I was in the shower. And when I came out, Miles told me that she just wanted to check in, just wanted to see how we were doing, and had expressed her concern that I was dragging the family through drama when everyone was just trying to move forward peacefully. Family called. Not my parents. They'd mostly stopped calling directly, but aunts and uncles, cousins I hadn't talked to in years, all of them calling to tell me that I was being unreasonable, that I should let this go, that I was making myself look bad by pursuing it. Their calls had a particular quality, like they'd been coached, like my mother had made the rounds and gathered support, like this had already been decided by a committee, and my only choice was whether to accept the decision gracefully or be labeled as the problem. One cousin actually said it to me directly. Everyone thinks you're trying to take advantage of them. Everyone thinks you're being greedy. I was sitting in my car during my lunch break, parked in an empty part of the parking lot away from the office, when I called Brooke and asked if she knew an attorney who could actually help me, who could do more than just consult, who could actually file something and make this real in the legal system. "I know someone," Brooke said. "Her name is Paige. She's a bit tough, but she's good. I think you need someone tough right now. Someone who won't let you back down." Paige's office was in a professional building downtown, and when I walked in for the appointment, I knew immediately that Brooke was right. Paige was a woman about my age, probably a few years younger, with gray-streaked hair and the kind of direct eye contact that made it clear she didn't waste time on anything except getting to the truth of a situation. "Tell me everything," she said, and I did. The legal reality was more complicated than I'd wanted it to be, more nuanced, more dependent on proving things that I'd never thought needed proving. Paige explained it all in a way that was clinical and clear, and made me understand that this wasn't just about the money I'd paid, wasn't just about the fact that I could prove $50,000 in contributions. "What we need to prove," Paige said, pulling out a legal pad and writing in shorthand that made sense only to her, "is that you paid with the intent of having an ownership interest in the property, and that your parents accepted those payments with the understanding that you were making them toward that interest." "They told me they'd make it right," I said, pulling up the screenshot I'd saved. "Dad texted me after I paid for the roof. He said, 'You're saving our house, we'll make it right someday.'" Paige's eyes sharpened. "Do you have that text? Can you show me?" I showed her. She read it twice, then looked up at me. "Any other messages like this? Any time they acknowledged that what you were paying was something beyond just help? Any time they said it was your security or your investment or anything like that?" I scrolled through years of text message conversations, the long back and forth of a daughter taking care of aging parents, of promises made and implied and never quite delivered on. There were 3 messages that stood out. 3 moments where my father or mother had said something that acknowledged the weight of what I was carrying. "These 3, Paige said, pointing them out. "These are good. These show acknowledgement. This shows intent. If we can establish that you relied on these promises, that you made the payments based on reasonable belief that you'd have a claim to the property, then we have something to work with." "How do we establish that?" I asked. "Well," Paige said, looking at me directly, "you would have to testify about your state of mind at the time you were making the payments. You'd have to explain why you kept doing it, why you didn't stop, why a reasonable person in your position would believe they were making these payments toward future ownership." The text that changed everything was dated August 2017, over 6 years before the Sunday dinner. Over 6 years before I'd learned that I'd been carrying the house on my back the entire time. Dad had sent it while I was still at work, an odd time for him to text, because he rarely messaged directly and usually waited for me to call. "You're saving our house," he wrote. "We'll make it right." It was followed by another message, almost immediately after. "We know what you're doing, and we know you're not asking for anything. We'll make sure you're taken care of. This isn't forgotten." I'd saved those messages because they felt important at the time, because they seemed like acknowledgement of something significant, because they made me feel like maybe this sacrifice was being seen, was being recognized, was building toward something that mattered. Now, they felt like a promise that had been broken with deliberate cruelty. Paige went very quiet when she read them. She read them once, then again, then she set my phone down on the desk and looked up at me with an expression that was serious and careful and almost pitying. "Rainey," she said, "this isn't a gift story anymore." The words landed like a verdict. I hadn't killed anyone, hadn't broken any laws, hadn't done anything except love my family and try to help them stay afloat. But somehow I'd become the subject of a legal case. The person whose testimony would matter, the person whose belief in those promises was now going to be examined and challenged and used to determine whether I had any right to claim part of a house that I'd essentially paid for. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," Paige said, "we document everything. We make sure we have every receipt, every message, every piece of evidence that shows what you paid and what was promised. And we decide whether you want to try mediation first or whether we file something in court." "What would we file?" "A claim for equitable interest," Paige said, which sounded serious and legal and like it would make my family hate me forever. "Basically, we're saying that based on your payments and your parents' promises, you have a legal right to part of the property. It's not the same as ownership, but it's a claim. And it would tie up the house until we resolved it." The house. Owen's house now, supposedly. The house that he was already talking about refinancing, already planning to cash out, already treating like he'd won something significant. "Can we stop him from refinancing?" I asked. Paige smiled. It was the first time I'd seen her smile, and it made her look dangerous and sharp. "Yes," she said. "We can absolutely do that." Owen tried to refinance in September, and that's when everything came into the open, when the quiet legal consultation became something that couldn't be hidden anymore. When someone other than my family became aware that there was a problem with the title of the house. He didn't tell me he was doing it. I found out when a woman named Camille called me at work and introduced herself as a loan officer with Pacific Coast Mortgage. She was polite and professional and confused. And she said something that made my heart stop in my chest. "I'm calling because your name appears on an insurance claim check from 2018, she said, reading from something on her screen. "There's a water damage claim filed on the property, and it looks like the check was made out to you. I'm just trying to clarify the chain of title, because the applicant says he's the sole owner, but you seem to have an interest in the property." I told her I needed to call her back and hung up the phone. I sat at my desk in my cubicle at work, my coworkers oblivious around me, and I felt something shift in the world. This was real now. This wasn't just a family problem. This was something that the professional world, the legal world, the world of money and documents and official channels, was going to notice and have opinions about. I called Paige immediately. She listened to what Camille had said, And then she asked me very specific questions about the water damage claim, about when it had happened, about whether I'd filed it myself, about whether my name appearing on the check meant my name had ever appeared on the insurance documents. That claim from 2018, Paige said slowly, that came right after the roof work, correct? Yes, I said. There was damage to the interior, and Dad called and asked if I could handle the insurance paperwork because my mom was overwhelmed. So I filed the claim and dealt with the insurance company and the contractors. So your name is on the claim as the policyholder? I guess. I don't know. I just filed it and paid what I had to pay, and the rest got covered by insurance. Rainey, Paige said, you may have just given us something very valuable. This claim ties you to the property in the official record of the mortgage company. When Owen tries to refinance, they're going to see that claim, and they're going to wonder why the owner's daughter filed it. They're going to ask questions about the title. They're going to look into the deed transfer. Is that good for us? I asked. It's very good for us. Paige said. It's leverage. Camille was trying to do her job, and what her job required was understanding the title of the property well enough to feel confident that the loan she was proposing was backed by actual real estate that she could theoretically foreclose on if Owen stopped paying. What her job did not account for was a property that had been in family chaos for 6 years, a property that had hidden claims and questionable transfers, and a daughter's insurance claim in the official mortgage file. When Paige called her back on my behalf, when Paige explained that I had paid substantial sums toward the maintenance and improvement of the property and that I had a pending claim for equitable interest, Camille's professional cheerfulness evaporated completely. She asked very specific questions. She wanted to know about the title transfer, about the trust, about why the homeowner's insurance had my name on a claim, but Owen's name on the deed. This is complicated, Camille had said, and Paige told me later that in the mortgage business, complicated was the worst word you could say about a property. Complicated meant risk. Complicated meant lawyers would get involved. Complicated meant that the bank's lawyers would want everything in perfect order before they'd agree to loan any money. Paige also explained something that I hadn't fully understood before. Years ago, when my father had put the house into a trust, when he'd established himself as trustee and begun the legal architecture of succession planning, there had been something else going on beneath the surface. There was a moment, some point in the past that none of us had mentioned or focused on, where the house had been in danger. The property nearly faced a silent lien issue, Paige explained, pulling up documents that the mortgage company had apparently shared with her. Do you know what that is? I shook my head. It's when someone has a legal claim on property, but they don't file it officially. The property has a secret claim attached to it, and most people don't know it exists until they try to refinance or sell. The only reason this property avoided that was because steady money was coming in, regular payments, someone maintaining it, keeping it out of default. That was me, I said. Yes, Paige said. That was you. And if your father hadn't had you paying the bills, this house would have fallen into foreclosure. Your father would have lost everything, and now he's given it to Owen as if it was his to give. Janice showed her hand the way that people sometimes do when they get angry or scared. I was at a family gathering. I don't even remember what it was, probably a birthday or anniversary, something that required me to show up and pretend I was still part of this family. And she cornered me near the kitchen, away from the main group, where we could talk without being overheard. A smart woman, she said, her voice low and careful, stops before she ruins her marriage. I didn't say anything. I just looked at her, this woman who had never particularly liked me, who had probably been whispering to Miles for years about how I was overly sensitive, overly demanding, overly something. Miles needs peace, she continued, and there was something almost kind about it, almost like she was trying to help me understand something for my own good. He needs a wife who doesn't drag his family through the courts. He needs stability. He needs to not have to choose between his wife and his family. He needs to be honest with me about what he's known and when, I said quietly. Her face tightened. She looked around to make sure nobody was listening. He was trying to protect you, she said. He was trying to manage a difficult family situation, and now you're making it worse by pursuing this. That night, when we got home from the gathering, Miles admitted what I'd already suspected. He told me quietly, over late-night coffee in the kitchen, that Janice had helped Owen plan the transfer. Not legal help, but logistics, advice, someone to talk to about how to handle the situation with me, someone to reassure him that what he was doing was reasonable, was fair, was something that I would eventually accept and move past. She said you'd understand eventually, Miles said. She said you're upset now, but you'd see that it was the right thing to do. She said Owen deserved to have something. Owen was supposed to get the house because my parents wanted to give it to him, I said slowly, making sure I understood the reality of what had happened. And you knew that, and you didn't tell me, and Janice helped plan it. So I'm not the victim of a family decision, I'm the victim of a conspiracy. It's not that dramatic, Miles said, but his voice was wrong, defensive in a way that meant he knew it was exactly that dramatic. The marriage crack happened when Miles blurted out the real reason why Owen had been so eager to accept the house, why my parents had been so determined to give it to him, why everyone had conspired so carefully to make sure I found out only after the deed had already been transferred. Owen promised to cut us in if the refinance goes through, Miles said, and the words just fell out of him like something he'd been holding and finally couldn't carry anymore. Your parents, me, Janice, everyone. If he refinances and pulls money out, we all get a piece. I sat with that for a moment, trying to comprehend a universe where everyone I trusted had been actively planning not just to take the house, but to extract money from it, to use it as collateral for a financial gain that I wasn't supposed to know about. How much? I asked. Enough, Miles said. Enough to matter. Your mom needs help with her retirement. Your dad's health is not great. And I thought maybe we could pay off some of our mortgage, maybe take a vacation, maybe finally have some breathing room. Maybe what? I interrupted. Maybe live off money that you helped steal from me? It's not stealing, he said, which was the moment I really understood that my marriage was broken, that it wasn't going to be fixed by explaining or discussing or even legal action against my family. It was broken because the man I'd married had looked at a situation and decided that his financial benefit mattered more than his wife's financial security. I left the kitchen and went upstairs and locked myself in the bedroom. Miles slept on the couch for 3 nights after that, and when he finally came upstairs, he tried to apologize, but the apology was for making me upset, not for what he'd done. I stopped yelling. I documented everything instead. This was something that Paige had suggested, and it was the right move, the smart move, the move that made me look reasonable instead of crazy, that made my case look like something based on facts instead of emotion. Paige filed a request for mediation, which was something that looked reasonable and clean and hard to label as Renee being dramatic and trying to destroy her family. Mediation was supposed to help people work things out without going to court. And it meant that even though I was gathering evidence and building a legal case, I could also look like I was trying to be reasonable. The mediator was a woman named Patricia, and she was good at her job, which meant she was good at making people feel heard, while also understanding that nobody was going to get what they wanted. She scheduled sessions with my parents, with me, with Owen, trying to figure out if there was any middle ground where this could be resolved without a trial. Owen threatened me before the first mediation session. He showed up at my office during my lunch break, which meant he'd either looked up where I worked or Miles had told him, and he cornered me in the parking lot like he was trying to intimidate me into backing down. You do this, he said, his voice low and angry. You try to take this to court, and I'll tell everyone you're unstable. I'll say you're mentally ill, that you're having some kind of breakdown, that you're vindictive and crazy and trying to destroy the family because you're jealous of me. I looked at him, this man who was my brother but didn't feel like family anymore, and I understood what was happening. I was supposed to be scared now. I was supposed to back down, to accept that he had the power to define me if I pushed too hard. Go ahead, I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. Say whatever you want. My attorney has all the documentation. Say whatever you want and let's see what the court thinks. His face went red, but he didn't hit me. He just got back in his car and drove away. The family meeting trap was supposed to trap me, but I saw it coming because I'd started to understand how these people operated. They were going to gather everyone together and express concern. They were going to make it about my mental health, about my stress, about my likely breakdown. My parents hosted it on a Tuesday evening, claiming they were worried about me, claiming they wanted to have a conversation, claiming they wanted to help. The living room was full of people. My parents, Owen, Miles, Janice, and my brother-in-law. "Rain's under a lot of stress," my mother opened with, and I realized they'd rehearsed this. Everyone was giving me concerned looks. Everyone was leaning slightly forward. Everyone was ready to perform the roles they'd been assigned. "We're worried about her," Owen added, and I almost laughed because the irony was so heavy. My father looked sad in the way that made me want to scream. The way that made him look like the victim. Brooke had warned me. She'd called me that afternoon and said, "They're setting something up. Don't react. Whatever they say, don't lose your temper." So I didn't. I sat there and I let them express their concern. I nodded at appropriate moments. I said nothing that could be used against me later. I performed the role of the reasonable daughter. When my mother pulled me aside afterward, when she did it in that private moment, when it was just the two of us, when she thought she could appeal to me woman to woman, she said exactly what Paige had predicted. "Just sign something and end it," she said, her hand on my arm, her voice gentle and pleading. "Rain, please, sign something and we can all move past this." The something turned out to be a waiver. A legal document that said I waived any and all claims to the property, that I acknowledged the house had never been mine, that I accepted the gift they'd given to Owen as final and unreversible. My mother had printed it out and left it on the kitchen table when I got home. Miles wouldn't meet my eyes when I asked where it came from. I took a photograph of it and sent it directly to Paige, not saying anything, not explaining, just letting the document speak for itself. Paige called me back within an hour. "This is an admission," she said, and her voice had that dangerous tone again, the tone that made me understand we had leverage. "Do you see that? By offering you a waiver, they're admitting that they understand you might have a claim. They're trying to buy your silence. Do you understand what that means?" "It means they're scared," I said. "It means they know what they did was wrong," Paige said. "And now we have proof that they know it was wrong. We're going to request their notary records. We're going to request all the refinancing documents that Owen tried to get, and we're going to request proof of your father's capacity on the day he supposedly signed the deed transfer." "Can we actually request those things?" I asked. "Yes," Paige said. "We can request discovery. We can subpoena documents. We can demand they prove everything. And if signatures were rushed, if your father's capacity was questionable, if any of this was done improperly, which I'm betting it was, then we have a case about fraud." The waiver backfired in exactly the way that Paige had predicted it would. She used it to request notary records, and when those records came back, they told a story that nobody had expected me to find out about. The notary journal from the day that the deed transfer was supposedly signed didn't show a location near the hospital. It showed a location that was 17 miles away, at a UPS store. At a time when my father had been documented as being admitted to the emergency room. There were no conflicting entries. There was no possibility of misreading the journal. Someone had notarized a document claiming that my father had signed it on the day he was in the hospital, at a location he couldn't possibly have been at. Paige went very quiet when we reviewed the documents together. She sat across from me in her office, which smelled like coffee and paper and the particular kind of serious that comes from legal work, and she said the words that changed everything. "If signatures were forged," she said slowly, "if your father's signature was notarized without his presence, if this was done fraudulently, then the deed transfer isn't valid. Owen doesn't own the house. Your parents still own the house. And you have a legal interest in a house that doesn't actually belong to anyone yet." "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," Paige said, "we request an emergency court order. We request that the deed transfer be invalidated based on fraudulent execution, and we request that the property be frozen. No refinancing, no selling, no transfers, until the court can determine what actually happened. The refinancing deadline was the push that made everything accelerate. Camille had told Paige that underwriting needed the title cleared within days, or they'd have to cancel the loan. Owen was panicking, which meant my parents were panicking, which meant everyone realized that if the court froze the property, if the court invalidated the deed, if the court sided with me, then Owen's plan to extract money from the house was over. Owen showed up at my door on a Friday evening, no smile, no smirk, just desperation written across his face in a way that made me almost feel sorry for him. Almost. Until I remembered that he'd been the one who'd texted about rent, who'd posted about the house being his, who'd conspired with my mother to take something that I'd paid for and pretend it was his. "We need to talk," he said, and for the first time, he sounded like he believed I might actually win. I didn't invite him in. I stood in the doorway and I waited for him to say whatever he'd come to say, and Miles watched from the living room, finally understanding that this had become real, that the courts were involved, that the law was about to determine who'd done what wrong. "How much do you want?" Owen asked. "To go away. To drop this. How much do you actually need?" I told him I'd have to talk to my attorney, but the number he was offering was $20,000, which was roughly the amount I'd paid for the roof, which was maybe 1/3 of what I'd actually paid for the house over 14 years, which was insultingly low, and yet evidence that Owen understood what had actually happened. I called Paige immediately after he left. She listened to what he'd offered, and then she said something that made me understand that we were actually going to do this, actually going to take this all the way to court. "If he's offering you a settlement," Paige said, "it means he understands he doesn't have a legal claim. It means he knows we're going to win. Don't take it. Not yet. Not until we know what else they moved." The pressure intensified after Owen's offer. My parents called. Miles's mother called. My father left messages on my voicemail about how I was destroying the family, how I was tearing everything apart, how I should grow up and accept that this was how family worked. But I had expected something. I had expected the truth. I had expected acknowledgement. I had expected that when my father texted me, "We'll make it right," he actually meant it. The cash offer grew. 20,000 became 30,000, became 50,000. And my mother called with her sweetest voice and said, "Janice thinks this is fair. Miles thinks this is fair. Even Owen thinks this is fair. Why can't you just accept it?" "Because it's not fair," I said. "And because Paige says if I settle now, I may never learn what else they moved." "What do you mean, what else?" my mother asked, and her voice had changed, had gotten sharp, had revealed that there was something they didn't want me to know about. I didn't have time to pursue it then, because Paige was calling on the other line, and when I switched over, I heard something in her voice that made me understand that the discovery process had revealed something else. Something that changed the entire equation of this case. "Rain," she said, "they're hiding something. The refinancing documents show a second property, a parcel of land. It's small, but it's valuable for development. It's behind the house, and it's listed as part of the same property transfer, but Owen didn't even know about it." "What do you mean he didn't know about it?" "I mean," Paige said, and I could hear the smile in her voice, "that your parents included it in the property they gave to Owen, and Owen never even noticed. He thought he was getting the house. He didn't know there was a separate parcel that could be worth more than the house itself." The second parcel was small on the surface, about 2 acres of land behind the main house. Land that had belonged to my parents for almost 20 years, but had never been developed, never been discussed, never been formally separated from the main property in any documents that anyone actually reviewed carefully. But that land was valuable. The property had been rezoned 5 years ago for residential development. The land could support 2 to 3 houses. The land was worth at least as much as the main house, maybe more, depending on the development potential and future zoning decisions. And my parents had included it in the property transfer to Owen without mentioning it, probably because they hadn't thought it mattered. probably because they'd been thinking only about the main house when they conceived of giving Owen a gift, and the parcel had just automatically transferred with it through the deed. Owen genuinely didn't know. Paige had confirmed this by having someone contact him about the parcel, asking questions about his development plans, and Owen had responded confused, asking his mother what the person was talking about, not understanding that he'd been given more than he'd bargained for. This changed everything. This meant that Owen's inheritance wasn't just a house. It was a house plus development-grade property. This meant that the mortgage company would reassess the value of the collateral they were lending against. This meant that any settlement would have to account for the value of the parcel properly. This meant that I had suddenly become worth much more to them in terms of a quick settlement. Paige called me to tell me what she'd discovered, and she smiled. I could hear it in her voice, the satisfaction of a lawyer who'd found leverage, who understood that we were no longer negotiating a small family property dispute, but something larger and more complicated and much more valuable. "They're going to want to settle now," Paige said, quickly, quietly, before this parcel becomes part of the public record in court filings. Before Owen understands what he actually inherited. We have leverage now, Rain. Real leverage. We didn't go to court looking for chaos. We went to court looking for clarity. Paige filed for equitable interest, plus an injunction to stop the refinance, until the court could sort out who had claim to what, and she filed it in a way that was factual and documented, and impossible to dismiss as the ranting of a bitter daughter. The court assigned a judge named Henderson, who looked like he'd been hearing family property disputes for 30 years and had lost his patience for theatrical explanations about 10 years ago. He wanted facts. He wanted documents. He wanted to understand the timeline, and the payments, and the promises, and everything that Paige had prepared was organized exactly the way he wanted it. In the courtroom, with my father sitting across from me for the first time since I'd started pursuing this legally, with my mother refusing to make eye contact, with Owen looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, the judge asked very specific questions. "Did you promise your daughter that she would have a claim to the property?" He asked my father directly. My father didn't answer immediately. He looked at my mother like he was asking for permission, which was probably the wrong move because judges don't like it when grown men look to their wives before answering questions about their own promises. "We told her we'd make it right," my father finally said, and the words were quiet and sounded like an admission of something serious. "Did you promise her ownership or payment?" the judge pressed. "Did you say the property would be hers or that she'd be paid back?" "We didn't use those exact words," my father said. "But you acknowledged that she was paying for things," the judge pressed further. "You accepted payment. You promised repayment or recognition. Is that accurate?" The truth slipped out in the way that truth usually does when people are under oath and being asked directly, in the way that it's almost impossible to lie when a judge is looking directly at you and you understand that your answer is going to be recorded. Dad blurted, in the middle of answering a question about what he'd promised me, "We told her it was her security someday." The courtroom went quiet. Those words meant something. Those words meant that my father had explicitly said the house was my security, which meant he'd acknowledged I had a claim, which meant he'd lied when he'd said they'd never promised me anything at all. My mother tried to correct him immediately, tried to say that he'd misspoken, tried to take back the words, but the judge had already written them down, had already marked them as significant, had already understood what they meant. "Let me be clear," the judge said, looking directly at my father. "You told your daughter the house would be her security. Her security implies a claim, implies a right. Is that accurate?" "We meant that she wouldn't have to worry," my father said, which was the weakest possible interpretation of words that clearly meant something more substantial. "But you didn't use that language at the time," the judge said. "You used the word security, which implies ownership or collateral or something that belongs to her. I need you to answer directly. Did you promise your daughter the house or a claim to the house?" The silence stretched. My mother was looking at the judge with an expression that was almost pleading, almost desperate, almost like she was trying to communicate something through pure willpower that her husband was too stupid to understand. "We promised to make it right," my father finally said, which was the closest he could get to admitting the truth without actually saying the words that would commit him legally to anything. The judge ordered a structured settlement conference with full accounting of all contributions, all promises, all transfers. The refinance was blocked until the court could determine what the actual status of the property was. Refinancing was dead. The lender had pulled out after learning about the court action and the disputed title. The title was tied up. Owen couldn't sell, couldn't refinance, couldn't access the money that he'd been planning to extract from the property. And the court was going to determine how much I actually had a right to, not as a gift, but as a claim based on payment and reliance on my parents' promises. Janice told Miles that if I won, he was next. I heard this from Miles himself, who finally understood that his mother had been manipulating him, that she'd had designs on money that wasn't even hers to plan for, that she'd encouraged him to deceive me because it benefited her and her son in the short term. Miles moved into the guest room. We stopped having conversations except about logistics. He'd look at me with an expression that was half anger and half regret, understanding that he'd made a choice that was going to cost him, and not understanding until it was too late that some choices can't be unmade just by apologizing. The settlement conference was scheduled for 6 weeks out. In those 6 weeks, Paige continued discovering things. She found evidence that Owen had looked into renting rooms in the house to try to prove rental income for a future refinance application. She found that the original roof invoice had been paid from my account, but my father had taken out credit cards in both our names to pay for other repairs, creating a paper trail of joint investment that we could probably use to prove my parents had treated the property as something we both had a claim on. She found that the homeowner's insurance had been modified 6 months after the roof work to list Owen as the primary policyholder, and that the change request had been submitted by Miles, which meant Miles had been actively participating in trying to obscure my financial interest in the property, which meant Miles had committed fraud on his own wife's behalf. The insurance trap revealed itself in pieces. Camille called Paige to report that the homeowner's insurance policy had been changed without notifying the original insured. Me? Apparently, because I'd filed the water damage claim and been added to the documents when I filed it. The policy now listed Owen as the primary insured. My mailing address had been removed. The change request hadn't been signed by my parents. It had been submitted by Miles, his signature forged on documents he hadn't even reviewed properly. Paige called me with this information on a Monday morning, and I had to sit down because I understood what it meant. Miles had participated in fraud. Miles had actively tried to hide my interest in the property. Miles had submitted paperwork with forged signatures because that's the only way he could have gotten the insurance changed without my parents explicitly authorizing it. "He forged your parents' signatures?" I asked, trying to understand how deep this went, how far my husband had been willing to go to protect Owen's claim. "Possibly," Paige said, "or he was authorized to do so but didn't tell you. Either way, he knowingly submitted a request that had the effect of making it look like you had no interest in the property. That's fraud, Ryan. That's something we can use in court." I called Miles at work. I told him to come home. I told him we needed to talk, and when he got there, I showed him the insurance documents and the change request, and I asked him directly if he'd forged signatures. He didn't deny it. He just looked at the documents like he was seeing them for the first time, like he didn't remember making that choice, like the past weeks had been so consumed with defending Owen and listening to his mother that he'd forgotten he had a wife. Miles tried to flip the story like it would somehow undo what he'd done. He claimed that Janice had handed him the paperwork to submit, that she'd told him it was just administrative, that he hadn't understood what he was signing when he submitted the insurance change request. He claimed he didn't know what he was doing, that he was trying to help, that he'd been manipulated by his mother. Paige didn't believe him. She also didn't believe that these claims would hold up to any serious legal scrutiny, and she told Miles that unless he was willing to testify against my parents and Owen and Janice, he was going to be implicated in the fraud conspiracy. "That's not manipulation," she said coldly when Miles came to her office and tried to explain. "That's participation. That's knowing you were doing something wrong and doing it anyway." Miles admitted then in front of Paige, and in a recorded conversation that made it official, that he'd been promised a payout if Owen successfully refinanced. He admitted that Janice had encouraged him to help, that she'd said if Owen could get the house on loan approval, everyone would benefit, that Miles could finally pay off some debt, that his mother would have security. Paige said, "That's not just messy. That's motive on record." And it was. It was recorded. It was documented. It was the kind of motive that juries understood, that judges saw clearly, that made Miles's participation not just a mistake, but a conspiracy to defraud me of property that belonged partially to me. Miles moved back into the guest room after that. He stopped trying to defend himself, stopped trying to argue that he'd been manipulated. The notary record dropped like a brick in the courtroom the day we presented the evidence. Paige had obtained the official notary journal from the state, the book where Alicia Voss had recorded every document she'd notarized, and the entry for the deed transfer showed exactly what we'd expected to see. The location was the UPS store, not the hospital, and the time listed was a time when my father had been documented as being in the emergency room. The judge didn't even have to ask many questions. He understood immediately what had happened. Someone had notarized a document claiming that my father had signed it at a location he wasn't at, on a day when he was under medical observation and probably not in any condition to execute legal documents properly. "This constitutes fraud," the judge said flatly. "The deed transfer is invalid based on fraudulent execution of the notary's signature and probable violation of the notary's duty." The judge scheduled an emergency hearing. He wanted Alicia Voss to testify about who had brought her the document, who had represented that my father had signed it, under what circumstances the notarization had taken place. He wanted to understand exactly how the fraud had been committed and who had been involved in committing it. Paige told me that this was good, that this meant we were moving from a property dispute into a fraud case, that this meant we could potentially recover damages beyond just the house, that this meant Owen had participated in a criminal act even if he'd done it unknowingly. The emergency hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out. In those 2 weeks, my parents' attorney started negotiating. Paige heard through the grapevine that they were willing to settle, that they understood they were going to lose, that they wanted to know if I would accept a structured settlement, rather than fighting all the way through trial. Owen tried to rent rooms out of desperation. He needed cash to pay his lawyer, needed to make it look like the house was generating income, needed to do something that would convince the mortgage company that the property had value that could be extracted. He posted the rooms on a rental site, and one of the people who called to inquire was confused about something the listing said. It mentioned prior contributions by Diana, in what looked like original document language, not Owen's writing. It mentioned that the space was being rented out to manage debt from previous obligations, and it specifically noted that the terms of the rental were temporary pending familial legal resolution. Owen had copied the language from the house title documents, or more likely his attorney had, and in doing so, he'd actually acknowledged in writing that there were prior obligations, that there were other claims on the property, that this house wasn't cleanly his to rent or sell or do whatever he wanted with. The tenant called Paige directly because the listing had included Paige's name as the attorney for claims against the property. And when Paige heard about it, she called Camille at the mortgage company and updated her about the new information. Camille froze underwriting immediately. She told Paige that the file was now officially classified as high risk, that no lender would touch it until the court resolved the title dispute, that Owen's attempt to generate income had actually made his legal situation worse by proving on the public record that he understood the property had claims against it. That was when Owen finally understood that he'd lost. That was when it became clear that there was no way out of this, except through a court decision, that awarded most or all of the property to me, or through a settlement where he admitted that I had a right to it. The final victory wasn't as satisfying as I'd thought it would be. The court recognized my equitable interest in the property, ordered a structured buyout where Owen would have to either co-sign the property with me or purchase my interest at fair market value for my contributions plus interest plus my portion of the parcel valued at current development rates. The refinance was permanently blocked. Owen couldn't do anything with the house without my consent. Miles faced consequences in the marriage that couldn't be fixed by apologizing or admitting he'd been wrong. The insurance fraud was part of the court record, and even though he'd agreed to testify in exchange for reduced charges, he was still facing legal consequences for submitting false paperwork. Janice's influence over him collapsed when the judge specifically called out the pressure campaign, called it emotional manipulation, called it the kind of behavior that had contributed to the fraud. She couldn't help him anymore because she was part of the problem that the court was addressing. My parents had to accept that the house was no longer theirs to control, that their promises to me had been legally binding, that all those years when they said they'd make it right, they'd actually created a legal obligation to do so. They signed a lease for my property at a rate they could afford, and for the first time in my life, the financial relationship between us was explicit and documented and fair. Owen lost the chance to refinance, lost the ability to extract wealth from the property, lost the fantasy of free ownership. He could live there if he paid a rent amount that reflected fair market value, or he could buy me out, but he couldn't pretend anymore that it was simply his. They thought I'd stay quiet because it was family. But receipts don't lie, and neither do court records. Every payment I'd made, every promise they'd made, every document that had been fraudulently executed, it was all part of the official record now. If you've ever been used as the family wallet, if you've ever sent money for the house and the bills and the emergencies, and had people refuse to acknowledge that the money meant anything, that you had any claim, that you'd done anything except voluntarily give your life away, reach out for legal help before you spend more than you can afford to lose. You might be building a claim and not even know it. Subscribe.